let's come back. We're looking at an enormous scalar. We're looking at the way in which an immense swath of the world resonated, and resonated several times over. One of the deepest resonances was when written language came into play. And written language implies immediately that one has to be able to write. And it was very rare for a man or a woman to be able to be literate, to be able to read and write over 6,000 years ago. But there were men and women who learned to read and write. The males largely were called scribes. The females largely were hidden behind the scenes, but behind the scenes they were literate in the sense that they could tell among the children which of those boys and girls, in a feminine wisdom way, had the propensity to be encouraged to begin reading and writing. And so the women used their reading and writing behind the scenes, and the scribes farmed out their capacities largely to royals. And so the scribes became those who eventually became the lawyers, who read and write to service those who are royally rich, etc., powerful because of that. And they have an adjunct called the court, and there are officers of the law called the police, and they are all under the pyramidal pecking order of the judges headed by the supreme judges, and that this is the judicial branch of government, and the tyranny now is not from the executive or the legislative, but from the judicial branch. We live under a judicial tyranny. You can go to jail if you can't pay someone to keep you out. There are so many laws on the books. You can be gotten at any time for infractions you never even knew, especially in 2014. There are like 10,000 new laws applicable now. You can't possibly watch out. But the wisdom of the women is more and more intact as the scribal, legal eagle nature of the men bastardizes the key for civilization, which is being able to read and write. And to read and write means that one can have meaningful clusters, not only of people, but of what they do. And so eventually, within 1,000 years, the origin of written language is about 4350 BC. By 3350 BC, written language had constellated very much larger groups of men and women, of human beings, and they became the prototypes of the cities. And by that time, there was a recognition that civitas, civilization, was because of the cities. But the deeper wisdom was that it was language that is the real thread of civilization. The being able not only to read and write and to live in cities, but a tremendous shift came about 4000 BC, about 6,000 years ago. There were enough men and women who tended to pair together so that there were couples. And the archetypal couple is Adam and Eve, who ate from the tree of knowledge. They learned to read and write. And they learned that just being au naturel was not really enough. One had to cover up. One had to wear skins. Clothing was the first sign that they were needing to live beyond nature. No more au naturel. No more wandering around naked, or one now was not just naked, one was nude. One had to cover up. And that this was mythically the image, the image sociale, where one understood you couldn't stay in Eden anymore in the natural state. And so Adam and Eve were not exiled from Eden. They walked out in search of places that would be new to them, where they could be clothed in keeping with the resonances that were coming out of their reading and writing and living and exploring and pairing and bringing out of the fertile zero field of nature, not a formlessness that was helpless and negligible and negating, but was fertile. And so the spontaneity that came, and one recognized that there was a field, not just a fertile zero field, but one went out and became acquainted with the startling revealing that there was another field, a field of consciousness, and that the field of consciousness was a fertile infinite field. And that infinite field was at home and accepted by the natural field, so that the infinite and the zero were both very happily in complementarity, and that gave rise to the high dharma. That gave rise to the Parayana. Going beyond, going across the what would have been a gulf of formlessness into a new spontaneity that worked the zeros into what was and revealed the infinities that were really there then. One of the things that happened when quantum electrodynamics began to have a math in the late 1940s that was powerful enough to write it, to be able to have some who could read that writing and understand the quantum electrodynamics, the QED, that the previous understanding was deeply limited and thus flawed and needed to be not just replaced, but the entire mathematique needed to be recalibrated. And one of the geniuses that emerged at that time was Richard Feynman, who realized it isn't just that the zeros and infinities need to be brought into play. The equations that were trying to predict what would happen on the subatomic level, on the quantum level, were constantly turning up infinities in the equations, in the math. And so most people got around it by doing a caveat. We will not deal with exactness anymore. We will deal with probabilities. And so probability theory came into play. In economics, it was John Maynard Keynes. In mathematics, it was Johnny von Neumann. And so the whole thing about probability brought in the fact that the strategy that really works with this non-specific, non-perfect, non-exact mathematic is that in probabilities, one now deals with a situation of a game. And so game theory got born in the early 1940s and achieved its magisterial form by John von Neumann, who not only was a math genius, but he was one of the 5 Hungarians. They were called the Martians of the new science. And his classic book on game theory with one of his friends was published by Princeton in 1946. And it was applied not just to economics and not just to society, but to military, corporate control. And what came into play was not an empire, but something that succeeds very quietly what empires fail to deliver, and that is a feudal society. When Rome fell was the beginnings of the feudal society, not just of the Middle Ages, but what was used to be called, correctly, the Dark Ages. No one, except a very select few, were encouraged to, were allowed to, were finally, under punishment, abated temporarily as long as you work for us, allowed to learn to read and write. Everyone else became illiterate in the sense that they declined back to a quality, sociologically it's called serfdom. Serfdom is not just slavery from which you can be remitted, but serfdom you cannot. Your mother plowing the field dropped you in the field, and you will drop in that field when it comes your turn to die. That's serfdom. Ensuring that is an ideological construct that gets its authority because it has co-opted the mythic quality of language, oral language. You are not allowed to say, you're not allowed to speak, not just to anyone, even to yourself. Such and such and so, and thus, on and on. Never mind that you can't read and write, you also can't talk. You can't hear. There is no one who has ears to hear anymore. The Satan loves that. The Satan, in Hebrew, the article is always accompanied with the name because it's not a male or female, it's a neuter. Neutered. It's not anyone. It's not a meeting of the genders into complexity, it's a neutering of genders into digitalized serfdom robotics that is predictable, especially by game theory. So if you inculcate and addict the population into games, playing games, especially the young males playing games, the younger the better. The population that doesn't play games so much are the females. Because they talk. They listen. And when there are no men to talk to, they talk with each other. They listen to each other. They listen to the children. They learn the children how to talk. They listen to the children, and this carries over. And you don't have to be particularly a mother to do this. Being around women, being around children brings this about. It's a quality where wisdom has a feminine gender to it, almost worldwide, in the sense that it is the wiseness of being able not only to read between the lines, but to hear between the words. To hear and to be able, in that listening, to occasionally refine it so that one is not listening to what is in between words or in between sentences or even in between vowels. One begins to hear silence. And when we are refined enough to be familiar and at home listening to silence, spontaneously, what occurs is everything. It's no longer limited to gates, stargates or whatever. It's the entire complementary field of consciousness and nature at play in the fields of the Lord. Then one gets, as Ashvaghosha writes in the Awakening of Faith in the Mahayana, about 90 AD, about the time that St. John wrote the Apocalypse, about the time that the Grail was returned from the west of Britain to Antioch. They couldn't return it to St. John. He was imprisoned on Patmos. But they stopped by Ephesus and picked up from his place that was still preserving the sketches that his mentor for many years, Mary Magdalene, had made, the sketches of the young Jesus, of the mature Jesus, of St. John as a young man, of his brother, St. James, who was killed. He was beheaded by King Agrippa when he was just in his early 30s. All of these portraits were collected and taken with the cup and taken and finally found a place in Antioch where there was enough of a community of the way in which there was a sheath for the cup made of the portraits of what was available, and portraits of Peter and Paul and Luke. And she had not done the portrait of Mark, the older Mark. He was not very tall. He was about 5'4", kind of burly, and long beard and hair. He looked leonine, looked lion-like. That sheath held the cup, which held a couple of quarts, about a liter of wine, enough to fill not all the glasses, but you diluted it with water because it was concentrated. It was costly to ship. And so the wine was poured, and then the water was poured to make the wine. And the water pourer was 10-year-old Mark, John Mark, who became Saint Mark, on the second story of his parents' home in Jerusalem. His mother was Mary, one of the four sisters of Jesus, and his father was from originally the island of Cyprus, where his brother, named son of Nabas, their father was named Nabas, so he was called Barnabas. And those were the parents of Mark. This is what Ashvaghosha wrote. Having matured and grown the seed of St. Thomas through an intermediary, his name was Parshva, who's the one that converted Ashvaghosha from an arrogant Brahmin, expert lawyer, arguing about religious truths, into realizing that there is something beyond what can be posited as truths. What is the Mahayana? It is the soul of all sentient beings that constitutes all things in the world, phenomenal and super-phenomenal. Through and through this soul, we can disclose what the Mahayana signifies. Because the soul in itself, involving the quintessence, the fifth essence of the Mahayana. 1, 2, 3, 4. Consciousness is the fifth essence. It's the thumb of the hand. It makes it possible to do things you were never able to do before, like writing and reading. It becomes, in its relative or transitory aspect, through the law of causation, birth and death. That limitation in Sanskrit is called samsara. That samsara is much more powerful than karma. Karma has a pair. The translated word for it is merit. But samsara is the whole world in which those who are trying to get for other reasons merit, and trying to avoid for skittish good reasons karma, become those who are enmeshed in an ideology. Those who are not clever enough, powerful enough to get into ideological entrapment fall into a mythic, increasingly beggared, reduced mythic horizon of what one talks about with everyone who is talking about to you, what one talks about, and the common denominator subsides, like the scale of Twitter or Facebook slowly subsiding into this dull mediocrity of allness with a ness sizzling in it, which is based upon an increasingly dominated ritual base, a comportment of what people do, how they do it, becomes more and more limited. Everyone does this. This is how you do that to get this. That links with this, and that does this. And increasingly one gets what Feynman came to in the late 1940s. One gets a gibberish of the attempt to deal out the infinities, so that then you only deal with probabilities, you only deal with the game, with even just the theory games. And you just ignore all the infinities that come up in the math. He developed his own new written mathematic. They're called Feynman diagrams, where what comes in to play does such and such, and what comes out is so and so. And that one can learn to read not only in between, but beyond, in the sense of before and way after, the harmonic of what one is dealing with, including the infinities. So that there's a spontaneity, a spontaneous recognition through this recalibration of how to deal with the unknown. It's important because we had a classic example of the unknown in December of 1972, the last of the Apollo missions that were allowed, Apollo 17, touched down on the moon, and the last man on the moon wrote his book called The Last Man on the Moon. His signature reads, Gene Cernan. This is what happened on the moon when we were told that this would be it, no more. This is what a tall Texan jet fighter, space-seasoned, space cowboy wrote. Dreams really do come true. 4 hours after landing on the moon and wearing the backpack that contained my life support system, I wriggled backwards through the tiny hatch, got to my knees on the small porch, and cautiously descended Challenger's ladder, a rung at a time, until I stood on the saucer-like footpad. The sun glared bright all around as I had my first good look at the vast emptiness, while the canopy of sky remained thickly black from horizon to horizon, a contradiction that played, how can this be, with my logical mind? No fear, no apprehension, but a tremendous sense of satisfaction and accomplishment welled within me. My size 10.5 boot was poised just inches above the surface of this almost mythical land that mankind had watched so closely for uncounted aeons, and to which we had assigned properties ranging from religious icon and symbol of romance to maker of werewolves and clock for the harvest. Every night of my life it had been up there patiently waiting for my visit. I lowered my left foot and the thin crust gave way. Soft contact. There, it was done. A Cernan boot print was on the moon. As I stepped off the surface of Taurus Littrow, he said over his comm, I'd like to dedicate the first steps of Apollo 17 to all those who made it possible. I called to Houston and added, oh my golly, it's unbelievable. More next week.